Michael Jackson didn't change his face because he hated himself. He changed it because he was taught that being good enough was never permanent. Joe Jackson had a mantra he drilled into his sons. If you're not good enough, someone else will replace you. That sentence didn't just shape Michael Jackson's career. It taught him that even his own face had to earn its place. As a child on stage, Michael couldn't begin a performance until everything was perfect: hair, costume, makeup, because a single mistake triggered his father's rage, and that rage was physical. Control became survival. As he grew older, that need for control spread to his body itself. Food was measured. Routines were rigid. No flaw was tolerated. Then vitiligo appeared, something he couldn't command, punish, or rehearse away. So Michael did what trauma-trained minds do best. He tightened control everywhere else. Hours of makeup, repeated surgeries, endless mirror rituals. But the paradox was cruel. The more he tried to control his reflection, the more it slipped away. Physical transformation didn't free him. It built a cage, and the walls of that cage were operating tables, medications, and a face he no longer recognized. This was instead a story that began with disease. It began in childhood, when a boy learned that love was conditional and perfection was the only way to survive. If this exploration into the psychological architecture behind physical transformation resonates with you, consider subscribing. We're not here for tabloid narratives. We're here to understand the human cost of fame. The foundation was laid in Gary, Indiana, where 9 people lived in constant proximity and tension. Joe Jackson was militaristic about his children's success. Rehearsals ran from after school until 3 in the morning, mistakes punished immediately. Michael, the 7th child with the most extraordinary voice, received special attention that cut both ways. Joe told him his nose was too wide, his skin had too many blemishes, his appearance wasn't marketable enough. These weren't observations. They were delivered as facts, as deficiencies threatening the family's future. Michael was 8 when these criticisms embedded in his consciousness, and by 10 he couldn't look at himself without cataloging every flaw his father identified. The Jackson 5 exploded onto the scene in 1969, and suddenly Michael Jackson wasn't just Joe's son anymore. He was America's little brother, the adorable child with the massive voice and infectious energy. But backstage, away from the cameras and the screaming fans, Michael was developing a fractured relationship with his own image. He would stare at photographs from performances and magazine covers, and all he could see were the imperfections. His nose looked too big in profile shots. His skin wasn't smooth enough in close-ups. His smile showed too much gum. These observations consumed him, and they intensified as he moved through adolescence, that already brutal period when every teenager feels uncomfortable in their changing body. For Michael, this discomfort was amplified by constant public scrutiny and his father's relentless criticism. By early 1980s, Michael Jackson had achieved solo superstardom. Thriller would become the best-selling album of all time. The Motown 25 performance introduced the moonwalk, and Michael was at peak power. But something was happening to his skin that terrified him. Small patches of lighter pigmentation began appearing on his hands and face, irregular and unpredictable. Michael tried hiding them with makeup, applying darker foundation to blend the spots. He told no one because admitting this felt like admitting another imperfection, another way his body was failing him. The patches spread. What started as small areas became larger regions of depigmentation, contrast increasingly difficult to conceal. Michael consulted dermatologist Dr. Arnold Klein in 1986, and the diagnosis was definitive: vitiligo, an autoimmune condition where melanocytes are destroyed, resulting in pigmentation loss. The condition was hereditary, ran in the Jackson family, and had no cure, only symptom management. Dr. Klein explained the options: continue using darker makeup to cover white patches, though as the condition progressed, this would become harder, or undergo depigmentation therapy using Benequin to remove remaining pigment and create uniform skin tone. This wasn't a choice Michael wanted to make. Both options felt like betrayal, like admitting his body was beyond control. He tried the makeup approach for years, spending hours each morning blending foundations and concealers. But vitiligo was aggressive. new patches appearing constantly, existing ones expanding, and makeup became a daily battle he was losing. By 1988, contrast was so pronounced that stage lighting revealed patches despite makeup, and Michael began depigmentation therapy. The world didn't know this medical reality. The world watched as Michael Jackson's skin grew lighter, and the narrative formed immediately: Michael Jackson is ashamed of being black, wants to be white, is rejecting his heritage. Tabloids ran wild with speculation, printing side-by-side photographs, analyzing every appearance, treating his transformation as evidence of psychological instability or racial self-hatred. And Michael said nothing, because what could he say? But Vitiligo was only one front in the war Michael waged against his reflection. The other was surgical, beginning with his nose. Michael had his first rhinoplasty in 1979, a relatively minor procedure. The surgery was successful by conventional standards, but Michael didn't see improvement. He saw opportunity for further refinement. A second rhinoplasty followed in 1981, then a third, and surgical interventions blurred together, each promising to finally create the perfect nose. The problem with pursuing physical perfection through surgery is that perfection doesn't exist. There's only endless attempted corrections. Michael's nose became thinner, more sculpted, then too thin, too sculpted, cartilage weakened by repeated procedures. He developed breathing problems, required additional surgeries to address structural damage, and each intervention created new issues requiring further intervention. By mid-1990s, Michael's nose was a source of constant medical concern, frequently bandaged, occasionally collapsing. The surgeries expanded beyond his nose. Michael had a cleft added to his chin, cheekbone implants, jawline refined. He underwent procedures on his lips, eyelids, forehead. Each surgery was carefully guarded, performed by doctors who signed confidentiality agreements, and Michael would disappear for weeks of recovery before reappearing with subtle changes the public noticed, but couldn't identify. The cumulative effect was transformative. The Michael Jackson of 1979 and 1995 looked like different people. What the public couldn't see was the psychological mechanism driving this transformation. Michael wasn't vain or frivolous. He was trapped in an obsessive loop where his reflection never matched the image in his mind. He would look in the mirror and see his father's criticisms made flesh. The nose still too wide, face still not quite right, imperfections multiplying. Vitiligo intensified this dysmorphia because it was beyond control, so he compensated by controlling everything else with desperation. If his skin betrayed him, at least facial features could be perfected. If his body succumbed to disease, at least appearance could be managed surgically. Dr. Stephen Hoflin, one of Michael's primary plastic surgeons during the 1980s and early 1990s, later expressed regret about the extent of procedures. He acknowledged Michael had become addicted to transformation itself, that each surgery promised psychological relief that never materialized. But during years of active modification, these concerns were secondary to Michael's insistence and substantial fees from treating the world's most famous patient. The 1993 interview with Oprah Winfrey was Michael's opportunity to control the narrative. Sitting in Neverland Ranch with 90 million watching worldwide, Michael addressed accusations directly. Yes, he had vitiligo. It was medical, and he resented implications of racial shame. Yes, he had undergone plastic surgery, 2 nose procedures and chin work, but tabloid claims of dozens of surgeries were exaggerated. He was straightforward, almost defiant, and briefly it seemed truth might reshape public perception. But the interview didn't change anything fundamental. Half the audience believed him, half remained skeptical, and the tabloids continued their speculative coverage with barely a pause. Michael's vitiligo was now public knowledge, but that knowledge didn't translate into sympathy or understanding. It simply became another data point in the ongoing narrative of his strangeness. The admission that he had undergone some surgical procedures opened the door for more speculation about how many procedures he wasn't admitting to, and the cycle continued unabated. What made this particularly tragic was that Michael's concerns about his appearance, while extreme, weren't entirely unfounded. He was one of the most photographed people on Earth. Every public appearance was analyzed from dozens of angles. Every imperfection was magnified and discussed. The vitiligo patches, even with makeup, were visible in certain lighting conditions, and the media would zoom in on these areas, circle them in red, and present them as evidence of something sinister. Michael's paranoia about his appearance was partly self-generated, but it was also a rational response to genuine scrutiny. He was being watched, he was being judged, and his physical appearance was being weaponized against him constantly. By the late 1990s, Michael's face had become almost sculptural, the features so refined and modified that they seemed disconnected from human anatomy. His nose appeared almost translucent in certain photographs. The skin stretched tight over diminished cartilage. His skin tone was uniformly pale, the result of years of depigmentation therapy. His cheekbones were prominent, his chin was clefted, and his eyes, framed by what appeared to be permanent eyeliner tattooing, had a startled, almost artificial quality. When Michael looked in the mirror during this period, he was looking at a face that belonged to someone else, a face constructed through decades of medical intervention and psychological warfare. The question that haunted everyone who knew Michael during these years was simple: did he see what everyone else saw? When he looked at his reflection, did he recognize that the pursuit of perfection had created its own kind of distortion? The evidence suggests that Michael's self-perception remained fundamentally disconnected from objective reality. He would still speak about minor imperfections that needed correction, still express dissatisfaction with features that had been surgically altered multiple times, still believed that one more procedure might finally bring the peace he was seeking. This is the hallmark of body dysmorphic disorder, a condition where the perceived flaws are either minor or non-existent, but the psychological distress is profound and unrelenting. Dr. Klein, Michael's longtime dermatologist, suggested in later interviews that Michael's childhood trauma had created an impossible standard of physical perfection, and that no amount of medical intervention could address the psychological wound at the core of Michael's self-image. The vitiligo had simply provided a catalyst, a visible change that justified the obsessive behavior that had been building since childhood. Without the vitiligo, Michael might have found other aspects of his appearance to fixate on, other imperfections to correct, because the problem wasn't really his nose or his skin. It was the voice in his head telling him he would never be good enough. The final years of Michael's life saw him increasingly isolated, partly by choice and partly by circumstance. Neverland Ranch, once a vibrant estate filled with children and activity, became a fortress where Michael could hide from cameras and criticism. He rarely appeared in public without surgical masks, scarves, and umbrellas to shield his face from photographers and sunlight. The vitiligo made him photosensitive, but the covering also served a psychological function, allowing him to move through the world without his face being the primary focus of attention. When Michael died in June 2009, the autopsy report confirmed what he had been saying since 1993. He had vitiligo, the condition was extensive, and his skin had been depigmented as a treatment strategy. The report also documented the multiple surgical modifications to his face, the weakened nasal structure, the implants, the tattooing. For those who had doubted Michael's explanations, the autopsy was vindication. For those who had believed him all along, it was simply sad confirmation that he had spent decades defending a truth that should have been accepted from the beginning. But the autopsy couldn't quantify the psychological cost of the physical transformation. It couldn't measure how many hours Michael spent staring at his reflection, how many times he felt his body betraying him, how deeply his father's voice had embedded itself in his self-perception. The medical records showed the procedures and the disease, but they couldn't capture the tragedy of a man who became unrecognizable to himself in the pursuit of an impossible ideal. Michael Jackson's physical transformation wasn't a simple story of vanity or racial self-hatred. It was a complex tragedy born from childhood trauma, exacerbated by an autoimmune disease, amplified by media scrutiny, and sustained by a medical establishment willing to provide interventions long past the point of therapeutic benefit. Joe Jackson's mantra, "If you're not good enough, someone else will replace you," had created a man who could never be good enough, not for his father, not for the public, and ultimately not for himself. The face in the mirror, by the end, belonged to a stranger, and that stranger was the cumulative result of every criticism, every surgical procedure, every desperate attempt at control. Michael Jackson didn't lose himself in physical transformation, he was always lost, from the moment a father told a child that his appearance wasn't acceptable. The surgeries and the disease were just the visible evidence of an invisible wound that never healed.